I think there's a lot of great controllers out there right now. As of writing this review, these two controllers are my absolute favorites. The KK3 Max offers a lot for its asking price, and it's definitely worth it if you're in the market for an endgame controller. If you haven't checked out my review on this, make sure to check it out. EasySMX also currently has one of my favorite controllers recently. The X10 Mechanic Master is a great alternative. The build quality on this is absolutely superb, and I think it looks fantastic in this nice silver. It had some of the nicest triggers I've ever seen on a controller, as well as some excellent grips on the back. One of the biggest standout features of this controller though is these mechanical face buttons. These face buttons are very responsive and they have a nice tactile click to them. This controller also had an incredible polling rate, and overall this was just something that was very easy to recommend. So when EasySMX said that they were coming out with a budget controller that was based on the X10, I had to check it out. So let's take a closer look and see what they sent over. So this is what they sent over for me to take a look at. Just the disclosures, well, this was sent over by the company, but they're not saying this review before it goes up. All opinions are my own, and as always, I'm just going to give you guys my honest thoughts to what I think about it. I've been pretty excited for this because I want a good budget controller to recommend to people. A lot of these controllers that I like are high-end controllers. The KK3 Max is pretty expensive, and so is the X10 Mechanic Master. This is set to be much cheaper than both of them. Let's just open this up and take a closer look to see how good of a budget controller this really is. Let's head over to their website to take a closer look at the controller and learn a little bit more about it. I don't actually know very much about this, I just know that it was based on the X10 Mechanic Master and that it was a budget controller. On their website, let's head under the controllers. It looks like it's under the Steam and PC controllers, and there's the X05. There are two colors for this controller. We have the Oyster White and the Lime. I have the white one. This retails for $29 US. This is going to be pretty much in line with a lot of the other budget controllers that we've seen. In fact, the closest comparison that I can make is probably to the GameSir Nova Lite. These are actually very similar on many different levels. I don't have the Nova Lite yet, but I am interested in checking it out down the road. Both of these controllers have Hall sticks and they share many similarities. The EasySMX X05 comes out to $29 US, whereas the Nova Lite is $25 US, or 35 Canadian. As mentioned, both of these controllers have Hall sticks. The only difference is this one has Hall effect triggers too. If you don't know about Hall effect joysticks, they're highly drift resistant. A lot of first-party controllers don't have these, and they develop drift pretty quick. So if you're looking for something durable, this is something that I highly recommend grabbing in a controller. This one has a very unique feature though. It has a ceramic chip antenna. This apparently helps minimize latency. As for how good this is in practice, I'm not really sure. We do have some RGB lighting on there. I think the RGB lighting is pretty neat. They did a decent job with it, but it looks pretty bright, so hopefully we can turn it down a little bit. The X05 supports Bluetooth. It also supports a 2.4 GHz connection over that USB dongle. It has a turbo function and a backlight. One thing that we aren't getting with it is we're not getting back paddle buttons. We're also not getting any motion control, and there's no audio port. But we are getting high-end controller features in this controller as well, so we have full Hall effect joysticks and Hall effect triggers. And for $30, that's not a bad price. So let's open the controller and take a closer look to see what it's about. Let's take a quick peek and see what's inside the box. Packaging is pretty plain and there's nothing really to report on here. Inside the box, we have the controller itself, and I think this looks really clean. We also have a 2.4 GHz USB dongle. This actually kind of reminds me of the old Kingston USB sticks. We get two joystick caps. We also have some grip tape if you want to use that. The last thing that we have in the box is a USB cable. This is USB-A to USB-C. So let's take a quick first look at the controller. Well, I'm pretty impressed. At the price tag, I expected it to feel a lot worse. Build quality feels pretty good, and first impressions are shockingly pretty decent. This feels like a pretty decent little controller. Not bad at all. First up, let's take a closer look at the size. This feels like a really good sized controller. If we look at something smaller, like the 8-bit to Ultimate Bluetooth, this controller is a lot narrower. The face buttons are a little bit bigger too, which is something that I really like. we are aiming for that 10mm face button size. That's what I prefer anyways. These currently sit at 10mm on the dot, which is why I like these. This is perfect. The 8-bit Do Ultimate Bluetooth is also pretty decent at 9.8mm. Compared to their X10 Mechanic Master, this one is only slightly wider, but these are very close in size. In fact, I can see where a lot of the similarities came from. This is almost a similar build too, and these feel about the same quality. I'm actually very impressed with how this feels. I think the KK3 Max is definitely the closest in size compared to this controller. It might be a tad bigger, and I think these grips are a little wider as well. There's a lot of similarities between these two. The face buttons are similar size. The joystick caps also appear to be similar in size. All in all, these two controllers are very close. So I think this controller has a really good size to it. Feels very comfortable in your hand. But just how heavy is this controller anyways? On the scales, this controller comes out to 217 grams. All in all, this is a pretty balanced weight for a controller. So how does this compare to the other controllers that I have? Well, let's take a closer look. The KK3 Max comes in at 244 grams. This is not much heavier, and I think this is also a really good weight for a controller. The 8-bit Do Ultimate Bluetooth comes in at 244 grams, and the X10 Mechanic Master comes in at 246 grams. So how is the build quality on this? Well, it feels pretty solid, as I mentioned first when we opened the box. The joysticks feel really decent, the D-pad feels like it's good quality, and the face buttons don't feel bad either. The triggers are decent. Everything just feels pretty good on this. Plastic itself feels pretty high quality. I don't hear any rattling in the controller either. In fact, I went over this entire controller and I can't find any major quality control concerns. Everything just seems to work. There's no flaws in the mold. I'm also extremely picky with this kind of thing, so I gave it a pretty good once over. It feels pretty dense, similar to the KK3 Max. The KK3 Max also feels pretty dense. This one just feels solid too. All in all, the build quality is pretty good. So how are the joysticks? Well, they're pretty decent. There's a small anti-friction ring around the edge, so this should help resist wear over time. Even after using this for a little while, I'm not seeing any wear on the joysticks. The joystick caps have a little bit of a rubber texture to them, and this feels very high quality. While these aren't completely concave, there's a little opening on the top which kind of lets your finger kind of sit in. This helps add to the overall grip of the controller. This is a pretty smooth rubber on the tops of these, but it's still kind of grippy. I still prefer the caps on the KK3 Max just because they have a nice concave opening, but they do attract a lot of dust, as you can see. They also have a really nice anti-friction ring as well. One of the biggest flaws of the 8-bit Do Ultimate Bluetooth is it doesn't have an anti-friction ring at all, and these wear away extremely quick on this controller. I had to get this cheap anti-friction ring protector just so it protects this controller, but it constantly slides up. This is one of the reasons why I don't use this controller a lot, because I constantly find myself having to push this down. I could fit 2 of them on there probably, but it might impact the range of motion on these. I've already been through one of these controllers as well, just because one of them died on me. So I don't really like the joysticks on the 8-bit Do Ultimate Bluetooth. The joysticks on the X10 Mechanic Master are much better because they still have that anti-friction ring, but they have a nice concave cap and the joysticks are very rubbery. This gives you a lot of grip on them and they have a nice texture on the sides. But all in all, these are a very good balance and these are really nice joysticks. Let's take a closer look at these face buttons next. These face buttons are the ideal size at around 10mm. This is usually what I like on a controller. They're also rubber membrane based and they're kind of mushy, but they have a nice kind of click to them too. They're not too loud and the build quality feels really nice. The font actually looks really clean on these as well. I really like these face buttons and I think they did a really good job. All in all, if you like a retro feeling face button and you don't mind rubber membranes, I think you'll like these face buttons. They feel high quality and they're pretty nice. The triggers are also pretty good on this controller. They have a lot of flair to them though. I would almost say this is too much flair, and there's a little lip that sticks over the edge. I don't think this is a bad amount, but it just sticks over the edge quite a bit. These do feel comfortable to use though, and these triggers are very smooth. They also kind of have a smooth coating to them, so there's no texture on these at all. There's a little line in the center though, and as you put your finger over it, you don't really feel that, but I think that's a cool design choice. All in all, not bad triggers, but I think the flare is just a little too much. I don't think this is going to bother anybody, but it's just something I've noted over using it. However, if you compare it to another controller, the flare looks pretty similar. The only difference is the end of the trigger is just going to kind of stick up higher, whereas on something like the KK3 Max, it's more subtle and flared out. I prefer the design on the KK3 Max, but yeah, it's not a bad trigger. If we look at the ergonomics on this, it's pretty decent. The sides of the controllers are nice and rounded. This fits very comfortably in the palm of your hand. Your pointer fingers sit on these triggers, and they're really comfortable to hold on to. It's not sharp at the bottom as well, so that doesn't really dig into the palm of your hand. This is pretty comfortable. There's a very slight amount of texture on the back. You don't really feel this, but it does give you a little bit of grip to hold on to. This kind of texture helps to resist fingerprints, but with this kind of lighter shell, I don't think you're going to have issues with fingerprints anyways. So where would I stack this controller in terms of comfort? Well, I think it's a pretty good size, at least for my hands, and it fits very comfortably in them. I think the KK3 Max is also very comfortable. I like this matte texture on this one, whereas the plastic on this one kind of has a slight texture to it, so it should hold up to the test of time a little better. So I think this one has a little bit of an edge over the KK3 Max in terms of comfort. The X10 Mechanic Master is also pretty comfortable, but the bottom is kind of sharp. Fortunately, when you wrap your palm around the corner, it doesn't really jut into the palm of your hand. The triggers on this one are a little narrower though. I think we just kind of hit a point now where all these controllers are pretty decently ergonomic. The 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth is also pretty decent, but it's a lot narrower, and I feel like my hands are a lot more bunched up together in the center. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but people with big hands might not like this. The grips on the bottom are decent on this one too, and all in all, this is not bad either. So in terms of ergonomics, I would say that the KK3 Max is pretty close, if not on par with this one. They're both really nice controllers to hold. I just think this one is slightly more wider, and for me, I just kind of like a wider controller. This just feels really nice to game with. Before we jump any further, I also forgot to check out the D-pad. The D-pad is pretty good, but it is very mushy. If you're looking for clicky face buttons or a D-pad, I would definitely recommend checking out the X10 Mechanic Master. The D-pad also kind of has a very unique design where the edges are kind of sticking out a little wider than in the center. This D-pad can also completely bottom out if you push it down. There's almost no pivot to this whatsoever. I don't think this is necessarily a good D-pad, but it's definitely usable. I think a good D-pad should flare out a little bit on the edges, so this is pretty nice in that regard. I just wish that this didn't bottom out so easy. If you're rolling this, you might get some false diagonals. So before we turn this on and check it out, let's just do a quick overview of the controller itself. We have the 4 face buttons, of course, the 2 joysticks, select and start. We also have a macro button down here. This is what they consider the O button. I'm actually not really sure what that is, but I even had to check in the manual to see what that was. This might also be used for pairing, I'm not really sure. But the macro button is down here on the bottom. This is also rubber membrane. In fact, all these face buttons are. We have the power button at the top. I really like the contrasting design on this. It looks really cool contrasting the white. On the back, there's nothing of interest. We have the Nintendo Switch mode, a Bluetooth mode, and we have the 2.4 GHz USB dongle mode. Let's turn this on next and see how this controller performs. It's always good to double check the manual because if you want to learn how to switch between the X input and the D input, it's going to show you how to do that there. It's also going to show you how to use your turbo and of course adjust the RGB lighting. So I've connected it to my computer and it automatically installed the gamepad. So let's check the gamepad in gamepadtester.com to make sure everything's working. As soon as I powered it on, everything seems to work good. We have some nice analog triggers and you can definitely see that these have a good amount of travel to them. These triggers are very accurate. I can push this down ever so slightly and it'll go up gradually all the way down to bottoming out. I'm also not hearing any sound when I'm pushing these down really quick. Face buttons all work on mine, start and select works, the D-pad works too, and the joysticks seem to work really well. Let's do a quick circularity test to see how accurate these Hall sensors are. That's pretty damn good. Let's try the left one. It's not bad at all. They feel really smooth too. The most accurate joysticks I've seen are still the KK3 Max, but these definitely take the number 2 spot. Let's take a closer look at the polling rate on this controller. Let's check first over the 2.4 GHz USB dongle. I'm going to select the controller and I'm using Gamepad Lighting to test this. Let's also check over 4,000 samples, so it should be right in the middle on this test. Then I just have to rotate the left joystick without stopping until we get some results. Out of all the tests that I've done, this one actually has a lot going for it. While it only supports 250 Hz polling rate, you are getting some remarkable stability at 90.5% nearly. The average latency is only 4.42 milliseconds. That's really good. And there's barely any jitter too at only 1.13 milliseconds. I'll try connecting this over a USB cable just to see if this is any different, and we can also check overclocking as well. Alright, so I've reconnected it with a USB cable. Let's go ahead and do the same test. I'm going to do the same amount of samples. I can already tell this is working way faster. Wow. Okay, so this is something I did not expect. Over the USB mode, this controller is giving us a true 1000 Hz polling rate. However, that stability is gone down to 82.4%, but I don't think that's a bad trade-off. The average latency is only 1.2 milliseconds, and there's only 0.5 milliseconds of jitter. If you don't know what polling rate means, basically the faster the polling rate, the more responsive the controller is going to feel. Most controllers, including the Xbox controller and a few others, only have 125 Hz polling rate. A good gaming controller will have at least 250. However, a lot of the best controllers will have 1000 Hz polling rate. You want this as high as possible, you want as low as jitter as possible, and you want your average latency as low as possible. The higher the polling rate goes, the lower these numbers are going to get. I definitely didn't expect 250 Hz over the USB 2.4 GHz controller connection, and something I did not expect was 1000 Hz over the wired. That's just absolutely remarkable. If you don't know how to overclock your controller, I'll leave a link to my tutorial in the description below, but let's check it out and see how good this controller is. Since I already know that the wired will go up to 1000, I'm only going to try connecting this with the 2.4 GHz dongle to see what we can get that to. Under all devices, I can see the controller right here. It shows up as an Xbox 360 controller. So let's turn that on. Once the service is installed, then all I have to do is just change the polling rate. This already works at 250, so I'm just going to try 1000 first. If that doesn't work, we can bump it down to 500 to see if it supports that. So now that we've overclocked it, let's just try testing it and see what it looks like. Interesting, so after the overclock of 1000, the only thing that I'm seeing is we're getting slightly higher averages and the stability is now 99.5%. I don't think I've ever seen a controller that stable before, especially over 2.4 GHz. We have still extremely low jitter, and the average latency is still pretty low at 4 milliseconds. Trying to bump it up to 1000 didn't improve our polling rate, so let's try 500 just to see what happens there. The 500 Hz overclock doesn't show us anything different. We're still getting 250 Hz polling, we're getting really high stability, low jitter, and the average latency is still around 4 milliseconds. Kind of a shame I couldn't overclock it any further, but 250 Hz over the 2.4 GHz USB dongle is not bad at all. It is also nice that we can plug this in directly with the USB cable to get that full 1000 Hz polling rate if we want it, and this is definitely overshooting where I expected it to. I also do want to check out to see how these macros work, so all I'm going to do is just press the X button first, and that seems pretty responsive. If I press the macro button in the bottom center and then the X button, that should turn on the macro. You're going to feel it vibrate. Then you can just hold it down and it'll automatically attack. As soon as you let go, it'll stop. I believe this only has one mode, but let's try again. I'm just going to hold down the macro button and X one more time. It vibrated again, and that shut it off. If I do a quick press by pressing the macro and X, it does seem to turn it on right away, so you don't have to hold it down. You can simply press the macro button and the button you want to turn it on with. I like using this for Skull the Hero Slayer and other games that require a lot of button mashing. Without macros, I have to constantly smash the button down, but with macros, I just have to hold it, and that makes it a lot easier. On an unrelated note, if you're looking for a fun game to try, I highly recommend checking out Skull the Hero Slayer. It's a fun little roguelike, and I probably spent way too much time playing this game. But the macros work well, and that's something that I look for on every controller. One thing we didn't look at was the RGB lighting, and the lighting is pretty subtle, but I really like it. It's a very clean glow. It also kind of looks like it moves as I rotate the joystick, and I think that's a nice touch. This is a good amount of glow, but it's not too much to be bothersome for anybody. I can also shut off my studio lights, and we can take a closer look to see what this looks like in the dark. So let me shut those lights off and let's take a quick peek. This is only with the room light on, not my studio lights. It's just a small amount of glow. I still think this looks really nice. Let me shut off all the lights so you can see what this looks like in the pitch black. And here it is in the absolute dark, just minus my monitor glow. The silver accents really highlight that glow. I think I'll actually leave on the RGB lighting for this. Usually I shut it off, but this looks pretty good. I had to get the manual out for this, but I want to see how to change these RGB lights. Double click the M button, the controller will vibrate, then you can enter the adjustment mode. Let's give it a try. There it goes. Let me shut off the lights. Looks like we have a solid color. This seems to adjust the colors pretty nice. So there is just kind of like there's a cycling neon. Looks like a solid color. Oh no, it is changing. There's a breathing mode. So there's a few different modes and you can go around and play through these, but they look pretty nice. I'll probably leave it on this cycling neon mode. I think this looks really nice with the white shell. So all in all, do I think this is worth it? I think this controller excels in a lot of areas. The build quality on the plastic is superb, and all the buttons and joysticks feel really solid. I think the triggers have a nice amount of flair to them, although I really wish this little piece here wasn't sticking so far out over the trigger. This doesn't really bother me though, and I still think it's a nice trigger. I also really appreciate the retro face buttons. The turbo mode also seems to work really well. I think the battery is pretty decent, but I haven't had to charge this yet. The only negative I can find about this controller so far is the mushy D-pad. This is usable, but it does require a little bit more force to push down, and it also bottoms out. I think aside from the D-pad, this controller is an excellent controller. And for the price, you can't go wrong. If you're in the market for a good controller, I highly recommend checking this one out, especially if you're on a budget. While not matching high-end controllers like the KK3 Max, this does offer excellent value for your dollar. I might check out some other budget controllers down the road if you guys like this video. If you're interested in picking one of these up, make sure to check out the link in the description below. If you have any questions about the controller, make sure to ask in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.